So what if you could say to a front-end developer, maybe you are a front-end developer yourself, so you say it yourself, build it the best way you know how, and with the best tools available. And don't worry about the fact that you're using Drupal. So if you're a developer and you're looking at the project and you say to yourself, well, really the best way to approach this is using Angular, or the best way to approach this would be to use Foundation. Maybe the best way to approach it is building an iPad. Maybe you've ruled your own front-end system or framework, and that's actually the most efficient and best way of doing it. So how would that affect productivity for that project? How would that affect the quality of the product? So I'm here to say that with Drupal, it's actually possible to do this. Okay, but to do that with Drupal, we have to look at Drupal in a different way than many of us look at it today. So we need to look at Drupal more like it's a content management system and less like it's a web publishing tool. So there is a difference between the two. So let's look at what a web publishing tool is. So a web publishing tool, the goal of it is really to capture content with the primary purpose of getting that content onto a browser. Okay? CMS, the primary goal of that is to store structured content and then to disseminate that content to any platform, in any presentation, at any time. Well, that's the way that I view CMS, and many of us, I think, share that view. So in today's day and age, it sounds a lot more appropriate to use a CMS than a web publishing tool, I would say. So that brings us to the topic today, which is decoupling Drupal. So what does decoupling Drupal mean? I mean, it's a large topic, but there's a few points that I think kind of sum it up. It means making no assumptions as to where your content will end up. What's required to do this is a complete separation from the back end to the front end. It's also about seeing Drupal as a component of a larger distributed CMS system, so versus a monolithic web publishing tool. So this is going to look familiar to everyone here. So what we have here is we have Drupal, we have the OS file system, content architecting tool, content creation tool, like the main interface, web publishing, database, all one monolithic system with the browser up top. Okay? So as I was doing research for this presentation, I happened upon the Docker website and found an interesting slide. And this slide illustrates a typical application that's written in the 90s. So we have a thick client, and then we have a well-defined stack, OS, runtime, middleware, and a database. So does that look familiar? All right, so that's the 90s. And the world is much different now. The landscape looks a lot more like this today. So we have wearable devices, we've got devices in your pocket, very personal. We've got laptops, we've got different formats. We've got PDFs. We've got machines talking to machines. We have the Internet of Things. You know, my water's probably going to have an IP address sometime soon. We've got cars. You know, I'm driving, well, I don't have own a Tesla, but if I did, driving like 120 down the highway, surfing the web. Don't know if that's a good idea. But anyhow, it's possible, right? And we have needs for contextual data. And we have needs for data to be disseminated in formats to address accessibility. So what if your content needs to be converted into audio? Or it needs to be converted into, any kind of content. So the one constant that we have here, though, is each one of these formats, each one of these devices uses content. So that's good news for us, because we're in the content management business. So Drupal is ideally positioned to provide that content to these devices and mediums. So it really breaks down into 3 different points that I can see. One is we need to look at the back end, we need to look at the front end, and we need to look at the glue that binds those 2 together. That's basically how we have to look at how Drupal is going to handle this kind of situation. So on the back end side, Karen McGrain, she is the queen of content strategy, and she has a few cardinal rules for us. First rule, back end should have reusable content. So what does that mean? So we have to look at the content and build it in a way that it's device agnostic. So it can be reused multiple different devices. We need to have structured content. Structured content, Drupal's really good at that. So we have content types, we have fields, we've been around for ages, entities, we're good at that. We need to have meaningful metadata to that content. We're good at that too. So we can use RDF, we can use tags, a variety of different things. So this is a little bit of the challenge. This is where it gets murky waters. We need a presentation independent CMS. Okay, so we have to, right now, as you know, Drupal has this theming layer, and I think it's still a good thing. You know, we can keep that, but it's how we look at Drupal and how we develop a Drupal that I think we have to investigate to see if that, you know, if there's a better way of doing it. So the concept of having a decoupled CMS is absolutely not new. In fact, it's been around for a while. Daniel Jacobson, who's the creator of the NPR API, and NPR is kind of like the CBC in the States. Immense amount of content that they have to handle. He developed an API system for them, and I believe he coined this acronym, create once, publish everywhere. So the idea is that you create your content once, and you have this multi-publishing system that is, or CMS, that is able to publish the content multiple different publishing endpoints. Okay? So they did that over 10 years ago. And they used their own custom CMS for that. Probably just didn't look around that. Well, no, not they use today. And they credit a page view increase 8%, largely because they're able to get their content onto a variety of, I'm just reading this now, of mobile devices without custom programming. So that's a big win for them, because that is their business model. They want people to read their content, and they don't want to have to say, well, to read our content or to access our content, these are the rules of engagement. You have to have a desktop, or you have to have a browser to read our content. Rather than doing that, they deliver content to pretty much any type of device. So, speaking of which, I found this architecture online, which illustrates this co-concept in their system. So, very quickly, they've got the CMS system. They have ways of getting data into the CMS system, multiple channels. Okay, some of it's via scripts, some of it is via manual entry. Then they have the static layer. They have the API, a caching layer, and then they have renderers. So the renderers, I mean, these are publishing endpoints. It's too long to fit in here, so I just changed the renderers. Anyway, so npr.org, mobile, all different formats. So Android, iPhone, WAP, all their different station sites. I mean, the list goes on and on. So that's what they've done. In January of this year, we had a client approach us, Niagara Cruises, and they had some specific requirements for us. So they were using a website which was pretty much held together with duct tape, and was not able to withstand the type of traffic and volume that they were getting, and also management of that site was quite difficult. So the challenge that we had was, and just to explain what their business model is. So they have over 60 cruise ships, and they have multiple adventures that they provide to the public, and one of those is Niagara Cruises. So you guys have probably heard Maid of the Mist. Well, Maid of the Mist is no longer. Now, don't worry, you can still go. It's now a company actually called Hornblower, and Niagara Cruises is the new Maid of the Mist. Okay? So Niagara Falls being one of the, a huge attraction. I mean, it's a world destination site. When they're in their busy season, they get a lot of hits to their site, because this is one of the main things to do when you go to Niagara, is get a close look at the falls. So back to the challenges. Huge amount of traffic. Any downtime during peak periods costs thousands of dollars. Okay? And the biggest challenge was, oh yeah, right, we need a new site developed, up and ready within a month. So
That's true.
So we had to have a little bit of a think over this, because if we're doing it with Drupal, there's quite a bit of upfront work to be done. Drupal's not a quick turn it on, there you go, see you later, right? So what I'll explain is kind of the progression of building this site and how it came to be that we built a decoupled system. So sprints 1 and 2, we're an agile company, so I'm going to talk in sprints. Start with a discovery, and we decided to build a static site. So a static site is great for scalability, great for speed. We can put this together very quickly, not have to worry about any of the Drupal overhead, zero CMS coverage, but that was okay. Because the client, their priority wasn't to have CMS coverage, their priority was to get a site up and running that could handle huge amounts of traffic right away. So the way we did that is we used a system called DocPad, and we used Bootstrap, which is an HTML framework, very quick to put together sites. And yeah, we just built their site statically. Had to be AO to swing away for accessibility reasons, and then we launched it, and they were happy. Until they wanted to change some of the content of their site, which is fine, because we knew that was coming. And again, it's priority based, right? So now their priority was, well, they had a blog section and they want to change blog postings. So we have to do a few things here. So we put a services layer. Well, first of all, we installed Drupal, and we installed it in a separate server. Okay, so we have the client server with a static site and DocPad. And then we installed a second server, content.Niagara Cruises. And then we put Drupal API in front of it. And then we created one simple content type. So in front of the, on the static side, what we needed to do is we need to have a way that we can take the content from Drupal, specifically the blog posting, and get them into the static site. So what we did is we used a Node Happy installation, which is basically an HTML API grabber. And technically what happens here is when the browser looks for a route, Happy interrupts that route and says, here's the file from DocPad, the static file for that page. So if you're looking at blog post 1, Happy handles that, goes to DocPad, finds a static file, and returns it. But that still doesn't answer how the blog postings from Drupal end up as static files. So what happens in the background is every 30 minutes, I mean, we can set it to whatever we want, Happy, or I think it's DocPad, sorry, DocPad calls out to Drupal and says, do you have any updates for it? And Drupal says, yeah, we've got an update for, we've got this new posting. Gets sent back to Happy. Happy says, okay, DocPad, you've got a template, static template for a post. Inserts that content, creates it in the HTML out folder, and away we go. We also have a way that if we don't want to wait for the 30 minutes, the content content editor or the content creator can create it on the fly and cause that process to happen immediately. So what we have now is we have all the great goodness and simplicity of a static site, and we have some CMS coverage. We have, let's say, 20% CMS coverage. So we've got best of both worlds. So the next sprint, they came back to us and said, that's great, but now we want more. We want events, press releases, tours, promotions, content pages. We want all the things that we would normally look for in a CMS system. Not a problem. So the exact same way we did the blog, we just created new content types. We have the system where every 30 minutes, call them back, bring us the page based on static template files. Okay. Sprint 6 and 7. So Niagara Parks, I contacted them, and it was an alarm. They needed to have French and Spanish, multilingual, and I believe double A. Tristan could update that with.
They only needed single A, but it was strict.
Oh, strict anyway. Okay, that's what it was. But that wasn't a problem either. So using the same system, we used Drupal for its great translation capability. We actually plugged in the Translate API so that we got an initial copy of the English site in Spanish and French, and then all they have to do is manually go through and make any modifications that the Translate API may have made a mistake or grammatical errors or whatever. But anyhow, it cut out a lot of the time that it would normally take to do it. So the point is, we're using this API system to help out Drupal. So this is starting to build into this distributed CMS thing that I'm talking about. Twitter, where you've got greeting, very common. And for comments, we use Discuss. So we're using a best-of-breed, best-of-class commenting system rather than using Drupal for the commenting system. I'm supposed to put those Okay, so what we have now set up is we have a system by which we can do multi-channel publishing. So in this particular case, we use static files using DocPad. And those static files were based on HTML templates, so their HTML would be fed out to the browser. There's nothing saying that those static files couldn't be JSON files or XML files, feeding some other sort of system, feeding DocPad. And really all we have to do is we just have to add on to the front end. We don't have to change the back end. We don't have to change the API. We just swap out the front end. So here's a quick summary of the components of this particular architecture that we use. I've got links at the end of the presentation, and I'll post a slide somewhere, probably a slide share, and you can check out some of these technologies if you're interested. So let's talk about what we learned and what you can expect should you decide that this is something of interest and you want to start working like this. So first thing, you will start to think differently about your CMS. You'll start to see your CMS as a tool for content writers and content architectures, and less so as a web publishing system. Front-end developers will see it as an API to a content repository versus something that's scary and they really wish they didn't have to deal with. And it won't dictate what technologies they're allowed to use and what technologies they're not allowed to use. Or perhaps it's difficult to implement. Workflow optimization. So often we're asked to create prototypes or to make sure that we're building the right thing. We want to create a prototype. And since we're building our prototypes in HTML now, and we don't have to convert them into Drupal themes, we can actually make those prototypes into the real thing. Just add API. Decreased dependencies allows teams to operate more effectively. Reduce the risk that a change made in one element will affect the other. Since we have this separation, the front end guys, they really don't have to worry too much about what they're doing on their side. And they don't really worry about that affecting the back end. Upgradability, interchangeability. So this is really cool. How many times does a client come to you and say, we want to redesign for our website? What that really means when you're using Drupal is you want to rebuild. You need to tear down the entire monolith stack and rebuild it. However, if you built their site using a decoupled structure, you could actually do just a redesign. The back end, if that's working for them, they're able to add their content, the workflows are good, the API is nicely structured for their content, then really you could swap out the front end and just have it tie into the API, not have a problem at all. So you could also add additional front-end publishing points. So if you've got the back end, it's working good. You've got the API, it's working well. And they come to you and say, we really need a way to get this data into, that car that's going 120 kilometers to the highway. We want that data to be summarized, and we want it to be in an audio format that you can listen to while you're driving. That's not a problem. You don't have to change the back end, you don't have to change the API. Now, on the flip side, if, for instance, you wanted to change out the back end, you could possibly do that as well. So if you want to do a Drupal upgrade to Drupal 8, you have the API structure, you have the front end, you could swap out the back end, so long as it's connecting to the API in the same manner that the Drupal 7 is. So it is possible. So, the next thing, very important, increased reliability and security. So, as we all know, with our beloved Drupal, if something goes wrong, it often falls apart. Stack of cards, right? So, MySQL failed, gone. We introduce some sort of a PHP error in a module, or there's, a core update, breaks it, all gone. That's less so with a static site. Very hard to break a static site. It's very simple, it's just a file that gets served. The other thing is, when you use that monolith structure, Drupal is sitting there out in the open, and that increases security risk. So if you take Drupal and you hide it, let's say, within a corporate environment behind a firewall, and just the people within that environment have access to Drupal, and maybe through a VPN channel, some remote access, and then you have the only point of access to Drupal being the API, and perhaps it's a direct point to the happy API for that 30-second sync up. That's very secure. To get to Drupal, really, you have to be on the inside. No longer are you exposing the whole Drupal stack to the web. Increased scope flexibility. So, kind of illustrated that with Niagara. They came to us with some high priority concerns and tasks for us. They didn't need full CMS coverage right away. So we were able to be very flexible in how we work with that. We were able to address their immediate needs, which is getting the site up and running within a month. And then we added CMS coverage later. Or what we could have done is we could have said, maybe you don't need 100% coverage. Because a lot of times as developers, I'm not sure about other shops, but we typically look at a CMS project with Drupal and we want to have 100% coverage. We did. Because it's cool, right? Every last word you want to be able to change on the site. But is that really providing the right kind of value for the client? What if they only change 20% of that site on a regular basis and the rest of it is once in a blue moon? So if you can be flexible in your CMS coverage, what that means is that you can apply some of those extra resources to other things that maybe you couldn't normally apply it to. So more planning and research, things like wider automated test coverage or more user group testing, things that provide perhaps a lot more value than having this one particular widget be CMS coverage that they change once every 2 years. Speed and scalability. So it doesn't get much faster than a static site. But you can even make it faster. Caching of static sites in memory, serving from a CDN, load balance configurations, distributed file systems. So my point is, if you need speed, you need reliability, static is a pretty good option. And of course, as we've already talked about, multi-channel publishing is a reality when you look at it in this system. In fact, when we're building it as a decoupled Drupal implementation, you're already in a position to easily add another front end and get a multi-channel system going. This is one that I really like, because finding Drupal developers is really hard. Finding good Drupal developers is really hard. So with a decoupling system, it opens the doors to a lot of front-end developers that would normally not be interested in working with a predominantly Drupal company. So, like my first statement at the beginning, they don't have to worry about the fact that we use Drupal. All they have to worry about is creating the best possible solution, using the best tools that and the best way that they know how. So, have I been selling it? So it can't all be rainbows and unicorns, right? So this is, it's not the golden ticket. There are issues, and I have a short list here. I'm sure there's more. I'm sure you guys can enlighten me to other issues if you've already tried this. So some challenges. Authentication rules are potentially more complicated to set up with a system like this. With Drupal, it's already in the box, right? You can set rules very easily. You can control what access to what. There are solutions. So OAuth is probably the go-to solution to manage roles and permissions. Happy API has a great session manager in it as well. So it could technically talk to Drupal and say, hey, what are the roles, what are the permissions, and it can manage those. This is an interesting one. So this is a bit of that communication between the front-end guys and the back-end guys. So reusable logic patterns, when we're talking about data, it really should live in the back-end. So if you're taking a data set, and let's say it's a raw data set, you're moving it to the front end, and the front-end developer applies a lot of logic to that before the display of that data, well, what you're doing is you're essentially making it so that that one publishing endpoint and that logic that was built in that one publishing endpoint is not reusable to another publishing endpoint. So that kind of logic, where you're reassembling the data, should probably live in the back end. So there's possibilities that that kind of communication doesn't happen, and then there's some wasted resources when you build the next publishing endpoint, and you want the same kind of logic. And then, like I explained with Niagara, we had the 2 server installations. Could be more. We run into some cross-domain request issues, but JSON-P, which is the old way of doing it in cores, should resolve most of those issues. We had a few of those problems, but those were resolved. So, where can it go from here? So this is me just kind of going crazy, thinking, how can we expand from this sort of a system into a distributed CMS system instead of like taking it right away from that monolithic structure. So I've got some pretty illustrations here. So you guys are probably using this already. So we have Drupal. I think of Drupal as like a component, like a service component. So we've got the service API in front of it. And then we're using other best-of-breed components out there that are available from the DevOps world in this space. So content delivery networks, caching servers, file systems, Pantheon, Aberdeen, Acquia. And then we can extend Drupal with best-of-breed services. So voice API, comment service like we used in Niagara. Google's got some amazing services out there like Detection API, Translate module, which we also use. And this is the multi-channel. So we have the Happy Router, and then we can have native apps, static sites, and PDF documents. So I actually have a demo here that I'd like to show you. See if this works. So this site here, please work. Live demo. Yes, okay, good. So it's a pretty basic corporate site. So we have our team, and this is running in Drupal. And we have different portfolio sectors. So they have energy, transportation, and it looks great in a browser. But what they wanted is they wanted a capabilities document for the sales team where they can take the data that's in the CMS and convert it to a PDF format that is going to be well designed, print ready, and yeah, this is what we have. So what we have here is a PDF creator that takes the different sections of the CMS and allows, let's say, a salesperson to say, okay, the capabilities document is for a client that's in the Toronto area. So let's add these people in there. And the portfolio project that this particular prospect is interested in is energy. Okay, click this button. And what happens in the background is this system will go to the CMS, pull the content that's required, add it to our template, combine it all, then check to see if there's any page breaks, calculate where the page breaks happen, and then recreate it again so that there aren't any awkward page breaks. And what we have is a different publishing endpoint in the format of a PDF. That looks perfect. So we go to our team, and we have Michael there, and Winne. Right, and then we go to the portfolio, and we should only have the energy piece of the portfolio. So this is multi-channel publishing in a different format. Okay, so this next section is actually the idea or the concept of being able to replace the database layer. So the concept is creating a standardized content model for your database. So JCR, some of you guys may have heard of that. That is a Java content repository model. There's a PHP adoption of JCR called PHP JCR. And what it is an abstraction layer to a standardized content repository model. So what that allows you to do is that allows you, in theory, to swap out the database layer. So you don't necessarily have to use MySQL. If you have a need for Mongo, or you have a need to use an existing database that is already using this structured content model that perhaps is already tied to an ERP system, you can actually do it. And then the ERP, because it's got transaction management, you can actually have a separate system writing to this database, and then Drupal has access to it. And it manages the transaction. And it won't break it because it's a common model. So, there's obviously you have to use this in every project, but what I'm doing here is I'm pushing the limits of where I can see possibly going in terms of creating a distributed CMS and components. So the next part is separating the authoring tools from CMS, from Drupal. So currently, people have to log in Drupal into the admin section. They have to go create content and then use the forms. And that is the authoring experience. And some brave people are creating lovely themes, like shiny theme and other things like that to make it better. But honestly, there's some great systems out there already for the content artists. There's Gather Content, Medium for some really super simple content creation. Perhaps there's a need for a custom iPad app. Let's say you're out in the field and you need to fill out a particular form, say a land survey or something like that, and you need an app that's a one-trick pony. Dead simple for your field guys. Add it and add it to the CMS. You can do that. In fact, what you can do is if you're using HPCR, it can speak directly to that API, skipping Drupal altogether, but the content is accessible from Drupal. So this is kind of the summary of how far I went with it. Obviously, we can go a lot further, and it's pretty crazy. So, is this all a bunch of blue sky dreaming? Bunch of crap? Maybe. But check out what Prismic is doing. Okay, so these guys, you guys probably haven't heard of it, maybe. They're fairly new. They have a CMS that they just released last year. They're from France. And they are building a couple CMSs that is very different than our typical monolith systems that we're used to. So they have this concept of a writing room. And the writing room is for that specific user type that just wants to write. They don't care about the CMS in the background. They don't care about the content model. They just want to write. So the whole interface is geared towards an excellent writing workflow and experience. Then you have the developers. So the guys in the front. They have an API model that they can browse in a development environment, and they can very easily find the data that they're looking for in the model and inject it into their front end. It doesn't matter what front end they're using. They could have a front end in HTML, it could be an Objective-C, it could be whatever they want. The point is as long as they can attach onto a RESTful API service, they can get their content. That can be JSON, HTML, whatever. So that's it. So, if you have any questions, happy to answer those questions. If there are any highly technical questions, I have Clint there, who is the lead developer on Niagara, to answer those questions.
Yeah, so you were saying that the logic patterns where you get your structured data coming from Drupal, and then they go out to the front end. Can you give some examples of what that might be? Is that like views generated stuff? And you know, like what would be something that you wish you had repeated better than you did maybe?
Well, we didn't run into that particular problem, but I was imagining a scenario where, let's say, you asked for a data set of all products. I mean, this is kind of ridiculous, but so you ask for all products, and then on the front end, you handle the display of that in a filtered manner. So
Yeah.
the filtering or the calculations of how you're handling that is done on the front end.
Yeah.
And the logic of how you're handling that is done on the front end. If you're doing it on the front end, well then your next publishing endpoint will have to redo that calculation of how to display that.
Like
So-
reviews or something coming
Right.
out of the second data set.
Yeah. So what would be better is to make a request to the API to say, this is what I'm looking for. You figure it out on the back end, and then send me only the data that I need to display. So the idea was that communication between the front end developer and the back end developer has to be there to avoid having to repeat that work for the next publishing.
Another good example of that would be if you want to build something to return paginated results. Do you do that on every front-end endpoint, like at a list of results, handle the pagination in a different way in each publishing endpoint, or do you do it once at the server level and create your API in such a way that you can request paginated results? You can request the number of results per page, and we'll give you a standardized format to work on all your front-end endpoints. Just thinking along those lines, there's a million little examples of where that would come into play or where it could be done wrongly or inefficiently in the long run. So just being mindful of that is the main point. The other trade-off, not to muddy the waters of thought, but the other trade-off is, for instance, we finished an Angular JS application where the intentional decision was to do as much processing as possible on the front end, just to really lighten the load as much as we possibly could on the server side. So in that case, we were actually, because it's an all JS application, the end user doesn't notice the processing happening on the front end, and that's just all sorts of, like when you start getting, thousands of hits, that's massive amounts of processing saved on your server side. So it is a balance, and you have to kind of look at both sides as you approach each project and situation.
Yeah, the caching strategy may be able to alleviate all of that as well. So caching those requests.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. To alleviate the crunching.
So, basically what I'm seeing here is, traditional Drupal, we have one system, content goes in, stuff comes out. We're talking about breaking it up, so content goes into Drupal, sends it to a front-end system that actually sends it to the user.
In the case of Niagara.
Yeah. So, it looks to me like this scenario is probably more expensive than this scenario. Or
Expensive?
maybe, well, because now you have this intermediary communication that you also need to, design, develop.
Not if it's static files that are living in the, let's say we're dealing with two servers, right? So we're dealing with the CMS, and we're dealing with the public endpoint, Scholar website. So if the static files are living there, you don't actually hit Drupal unless you require dynamic data.
Right, but Drupal has to generate that data to send it to the front-end system, rather than Drupal being the front-end system. We don't have to think about how.
Yeah, but it only has to do it every 30 minutes.
Right, but we still need to design and develop that process, so.
Expensive in terms of like the initial setup,
Yeah.
or expensive in terms of like the ongoing costs and the hits?
Both, I guess, because now you have more pieces to the system that are interacting.
I think we didn't feel like there was extra overhead. Like after we built the plugins for Happy to work with DocPad, and that system where we do the data calls and create static files. Once that was built, and now we're going to reuse that. And by the way, that's on GitHub if you want to look for the plugins. Once that was built, now we can just reuse that over. So we don't have that initial cost again. And adding more content types, when they want to increase CMS coverage, that was done in a sprint. So it really wasn't expensive in terms of time.
Yeah, I would, and just to add on to that, I would say, yeah, there is like, your first time around, it is quite different. So there's some upfront stuff that you have to build, some processes you have to develop. The trade-off, like right away, I mean, we were able to launch that site because it was just basic HTML. There's no Drupal theming layer to wrestle with. And I mean, a lot of us here are pretty good Drupal themers. But we all know that it's not ideal as a front end, like when you're a front end guy, Drupal can be a lot to wrestle with. It can be great until it's not, and then it can be a real nightmare to get that last 10% done. Whereas when we're working with static files, all blockers on the front end are gone. Everything's easy to do. Ajax is easy to do. An Angular app within your site is easy to do. Everything's easy to do. It's all HTML, CSS, and that's it. So though you have some upfront costs in terms of setting up your environments, and again, that's kind of a one-time thing, the actual theming is much easier, much quicker. You can use whatever HTML structure you want. There's really no limits. Changes are really quick. You can get people on board on the project very quick for that reason too. They don't have to know Drupal at all. So in our experience, it wasn't as bad and wasn't as difficult as it sounds. Once you have the basic architecture and the basic communication from Drupal to this, in this case we use DocPad, which is a Node.js static site generator, and is awesome in my opinion. It's not as daunting as it at first seems once you get into it. But it is a challenge, and was.
Like I said, we've posted it on GitHub, so let me know what you want to look at. I've got the links in this one.
So when you talk about the clients, if you want to increase the CMS coverage, do you think there is a limit where it's going to be a bad thing to be in this model? Because now we have too much of the CMS coverage, and so maybe you will would have been better just to go with the classic Drupal development. And what would be the kind of request makes it?
Yeah, so. Mhm.
User login.
Well, one example of that is, let's say you wanted the client to be able to control the layouts, so panels, for instance, and you want to give access to a logged in user to manage their layouts. It would be difficult in a structure like this. Whereas in Drupal, it's all panels, panels everywhere, and it's not that daunting thing to do. Whereas with this service system, it would be quite difficult. You'd have to build all that logic in the front end, right, as to how that's laid out.
So like just an extension of that, like when if you had a site, when you're looking at like a situation where you started out with a simple content site that eventually moves towards things like membership, does that then become a matter of recoupling to attain that, or is that kind of thing actually able to be handled in any kind of
So authentication rules and session management.
all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's possible. We haven't done it yet. We've researched it to make sure that it is possible. OAuth is likely the best channel for that.
But then that then takes that and puts it in front end technology, right? You're integrating another technology into the endpoint instead of on the server side, or instead of on the Drupal side.
Well, it's still on the server side, but it's more on like the Node.js happy router side.
So
communicating with
it's
Drupal.
still decoupled from there.
It is still decoupled from Drupal, yeah. So you can do all that stuff.
So you lose the user management stuff that's just baked into Drupal.
Yeah, you lose. I mean, depends how you use your imagination. It's just that you might have to rebuild some stuff and approach it a little differently if you want to use everything from Drupal. But again, the focus that we've been looking at is primarily using Drupal as a content management system in this, and only using it as a content management system. Now you can handle, you can have your user roles in Drupal, and you can authenticate with OAuth and have your front end, your kind of front end servers, your front end, back end aware of that. So it's not, it's certainly not insurmountable. And I mean, we have done like in previous projects, even internally, all the authentication done on Happy and Node.js, and it would be a matter of communicating back and forth with OAuth.
But just as like a, question I'm sure a lot of people asking, like, that is the cost then, is the cost of that in comparison to just activating stuff that Drupal does natively always going to be justifiable? Because I mean, if you're already decoupled your front end, you now have to integrate a new technology to allow something to happen that Drupal would have already done had you not gone that route. I mean, we can't always assume that a client's not going to have a login. Say a site goes in a commerce route and people want to manage their invoices, that becomes a humongous undertaking to build custom in comparison to integrating something like commerce, which is quite robust in its own.
You also look at the cost of building new static publishing endpoints every time.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're building a new static publishing endpoint, you have to build it as a monolithic implementation. That's expensive,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you have to build the whole thing from ground up over again.
Right.
Whereas if your new front end is just the front end exercise and is using the API and the existing back end,
Mm-hmm.
and you're only concentrating on the front end, arguably, depending on the complexity of the front end, you may have to cut 50% of your implementation costs because you're using the same back end logic and the API that you've already built.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a few different ways of looking at it. Is it going to work for every project? No. But it depends on the client, it depends on the vision of the client as well.
Well, I mean, I just think that what I find interesting is just when we're looking at projects that have the potential to expand, right? Like, you're looking at an agile project where you're working with a client potentially over a decade, right? Like, if you go with a decoupled site, I'm just wondering if there's sort of this challenge when you start to reach a point where it might have started out as a very simple static site, but then you're moving more and more towards, implementing things that on the Drupal end are quite well supported, right? Where you can just go and you can activate modules and get functionality, messaging, that kind of thing, without that being decoupled from the front end, because there's this reintegration challenge that I wonder about, sort of the long term.
I would say, to me, looking at the big picture, having a decoupled system only increases your flexibility for what you can do right across the board. And even in terms of using Drupal for these great things it provides, such as the translation, we didn't have to do anything special on the front end. We didn't have to reinvent Drupal translation. We used it and we communicated back to the front end We could do the same, I don't think there's a reason we couldn't, with a little bit of work, do the same with the commerce situation and still use Drupal commerce, as long as we have an API in front of Drupal that can communicate what it needs to do. Drupal can still do everything that Drupal does, including user management. There's just an API layer, and what that opens the door for is this multi-channel publishing. I don't think you really have too many real limitations that can't be overcome reasonably quickly. We've, in our example site, in about two sprints basically, we went from a static site to pulling in all the pages and menus and translations and views, listings, everything from Drupal in about 2 sprints. So I mean, we're using a lot of what it does. We're just not using the user system. We're not using a cart yet, but we can. So I think there's a lot.
That's
of
our
that.
initial build as well, right? So there's going to be found efficiencies for the next site that we build or the next publishing endpoint that we build, because those systems are already in place.
And the other thing that we do think you can have basic layout management on the Niagara Cruises site happening in Drupal. So in their within their content edit form, they're able to choose layouts, and it was just a small amount of post processing for the Drupal services. Just tell the include with your page data the kind of layout it's supposed to use, and layouting and creating these layouts on the front end is great because in a system like DocPad, we have all these different partials that we can just include everywhere and create different layouts very easily and reuse components. So it's actually, when you get your head around it, it's almost limitless, and you can use as much or as little of Drupal as you want or need to for situations. So to my mind, and everyone's going to approach it differently, there's very little downside long term to this approach. But I would agree, it is more difficult at first to get your head around, and if you have a quick, you need a quick turnaround, and Drupal, you're going to be tempted just to, let's just do a Drupal site and get out the door, and that may be just completely fine for your project and your circumstances.
So if I have a site that's set up like this, and my client comes to me and says, we really want this event calendar, and we found a module that we like, and we like the way that it works, and you put this in the site. So my normal step would just be install the module and let them do their thing. But in this system, would I then be required to actually build a front end that's going to read the API components that are coming in?
Yeah, that would be a tricky situation. The better scenario there, you can't tell the client necessarily, here's a better solution to what you could, is to look for a best-in-class service for calendar and integrate that, or look at best-in-class front-end calendaring system and integrate that. But you're right. I mean, if they're looking for a module that already has HTML output, would it be hard to send that over?
You can. Calendar is one that I thought about recently too. Calendars can be fairly complicated. Within Drupal services, you could theoretically say you're using a views-generated calendar, which you typically would in Drupal. You can send as much HTML output as you want over. So you could send the entire calendar over, and you'd probably send any related JS. You just have that sit on the front end so it knows what to do with it. So you could actually send the full calendar HTML over and just make calls to the API to get page 2, page 3, pull this events. And you can do it by Ajax. You can get into more complex static site generation. Just depends on your needs. Or you could use, we did a Node.js project earlier this year that was really calendar-centric. It was a scheduling app, and we used a superior third-party JavaScript-based calendar for that. And in that case, we weren't pulling from Drupal, but we were pulling from, it was decoupled again, pulling from a MongoDB somewhere, and we were pulling the data in and just feeding it into this, in my estimation, arguably better calendar than what Drupal plug and play provides. So you have options. You can just send the markup coming right from Drupal as HTML markup and plant it right in your page really easily and use it, or you can go for a more streamlined, modern approach to things. So.
Okay. We have time for one more question.
Which name sounds funnier, Hornblower or Drupal? Did you ever think you'd have to present with those names?
Hornblower. That one definitely because I speak Flams, so I speak Flemish, so Drupal actually makes sense to me. Hornblower, not so much.
Hey, Sean, you were admitting it.